Charles II never had a normal childhood because he didn't even have a normal face. His lower jaw was so huge he couldn't chew. At the age of 5, he still couldn't speak, and at 10, he could barely walk. This was a man born of incest. At the age of 18, Charles II was officially declared of age. But in reality, he remained dependent on the Regency Council and his mother. All attempts to involve him in real politics failed. He couldn't understand state affairs, didn't remember names, and couldn't hold a logical conversation for more than a few minutes. In council meetings, he either remained silent or made meaningless remarks. Charles's main task was to produce an heir. The Spanish Empire stood on a fragile political balance, and a childless king meant disaster. In 1679, he was married to Marie-Louise of Orleans, niece of Louis XIV. France hoped to expand its influence through this union, but the marriage was a failure. The couple lived together for over 10 years, but no children came. Marie-Louise repeatedly hinted at the king's inability to perform marital duties. Servants reported that even after marriage, Charles didn't understand how sexual intercourse worked. He had no libido, and his physical anomalies made any intimacy nearly impossible. For years, healing prayers were performed on the king. Some turned into full exorcism rituals. In the 1680s, priests were allowed to strike him with holy implements, chant Latin incantations, and douse him with holy water, often in the Queen's presence. It was believed Charles was possessed by a demon preventing him from producing an heir. These rituals were repeated over several years, often publicly. They were performed inside the palace, in front of courtiers, noblemen, and royal attendants. It only worsened the king's mental condition. Charles gradually lost trust in everyone around him. He believed his wife had been poisoned by French agents trying to destroy the Habsburg line. After Marie-Louise's death in 1689, from an unknown fever, Charles ordered her body exhumed to check for poison. The results were never disclosed, but from then on, he became even more withdrawn. Servants reported that he only slept during the day and wandered the palace at night, muttering prayers. He trusted none of his doctors. Every illness was seen as a strike from demonic forces. More radical priests and prophets began appearing at court, feeding his paranoia. In 1690, Charles remarried, this time to Austrian Princess Maria Anna of Neuburg. She had courtly experience and a good reputation. But again, the marriage remained childless. Maria Anna effectively ran the royal household and protected the king's image, although she knew he was physically incapable of fathering children. Charles began to lose control over his body. He experienced seizures, had trouble speaking, and at times didn't recognize close relatives. Doctors reported multiple neurological impairments. One courtier wrote, "It's a man's body with only 30% of its functions remaining." Charles II of Habsburg gradually became a living example of biological degradation caused by generations of inbreeding. By 1695, he could no longer walk unaided, moving only with the help of servants or seated in a special chair. His body was covered with ulcers, he hardly spoke, and when he tried, the words were slurred and fragmented. Saliva constantly dripped from his mouth, and he developed uncontrollable facial tics. Eyewitnesses wrote that he smelled of rot, with a sour stench emanating from his breath. His eyesight rapidly declined. He could barely distinguish faces even in dim light. One of the most disturbing symptoms was his body's failure to digest food. Nutrients passed through him almost undigested. Despite eating in excess, he lost weight rapidly. Doctors couldn't explain this condition, merely noting that his body rejected life. After another round of seizures, Charles fell silent for weeks. When he finally spoke, it was in fragments of prayers and random biblical quotes. He experienced periods of total amnesia, failing to recognize his servants, calling his wife by his dead mother's name, and asking when a war would begin that had ended decades earlier. By the late 1690s, he was no longer presented in public. Courtiers tried to maintain the illusion of normal governance. Edicts were issued in his name, but the country was effectively ruled by a circle of advisors and the Queen. Charles's final years were spent in a dim, stale room filled with the scent of medicines. He would lie for hours without responding to voices, then suddenly scream, claiming to see demons in the corners. One last exorcism was performed, this time at night by candlelight, in the presence of only a few trusted courtiers. It had no effect. In the final month of his life, he lost all control over his body. He was spoon-fed, cleaned, and dressed like a child. His skin broke down with bed sores, his flesh thinned like parchment, and his eyes grew vacant. In October 1700, doctors announced his condition was irreversible. The empire prepared for his death. On November 1st, Charles lay unconscious. Priests stood beside him, reciting psalms continuously. 3 p.m. His heart stopped. He was only 38 years old. But the horror didn't end there. On the orders of his advisors, an autopsy was conducted and recorded by court physicians. They noted that Charles's body did not meet human standards. His liver was shriveled, resembling that of an old man. His heart was significantly undersized. One testicle was atrophied, and the other was entirely missing. His stomach was full of undigested food. His intestines were obstructed. Their final verdict read, "His body was the ruin of dynastic degeneration." Charles II's death marked the end of the Spanish Habsburg line. With no heir, Spain plunged into the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that lasted more than a decade and reshaped Europe's political landscape. Charles was not a warrior, a reformer, or a conqueror. He became the embodiment of a genetic failure committed by one of history's most powerful dynasties. His life was not the tragedy of a single man. It was a lesson for generations of monarchs to come. Charles II was buried with royal honors, but without triumph. His body was placed in a tomb at the El Escorial Monastery, the traditional resting place of Spanish monarchs. Yet even the funeral echoed themes of decay and oblivion. The palace was not draped in mourning cloth, as was customary, and during the procession, several participants fainted from the unbearable odor emanating from a body that had begun to decay while still alive. The coffin was sealed quickly, and none of the relatives remained by it until the end of the service. Queen Maria Anna stayed in the palace but held no more political power. Charles's death created a power vacuum that instantly turned into crisis. Immediately after the funeral, negotiations over succession began. European powers prepared for the great conflict known as the War of Spanish Succession. France, Austria, England, and the Holy Roman Empire all laid claim to parts of the former Spanish monarchy. Charles's body lay in a marble sarcophagus, while above him, the fate of the continent was being redrawn. After Charles, there were no more Habsburgs in Spain. The entire bloodline, built on consanguineous unions, died out within a few generations. Doctors and historians continued to study Charles's case for centuries as a textbook example of genetic degeneration through incest. His jaw, the mandibula prognatica, is still analyzed in medical schools as a unique pathology. His mental and physical symptoms became part of European historical memory. Today, the image of Charles II is not a portrait of a king in royal robes, but a caricature of an empire that failed to stop its own decay. He was not guilty of his condition, but he became its symbol. This was not merely a personal tragedy. It was the slow agony of a dynasty rotting from within. The Spain he formerly ruled became weaker after him, increasingly dependent on foreign powers, and eventually lost most of its colonies in the centuries that followed. Charles II's death was the final proof that even the greatest empires can collapse not because of enemies, but because of their own decisions. His story is a warning, not about a single man, but about a system that destroyed itself from within. After him, a French Bourbon took the throne, and the chapter of Habsburg Spain was closed forever. The story of Charles II of Habsburg ended, but its consequences echoed throughout Europe. His death in 1700 opened a Pandora's box. The War of Spanish Succession erupted, a major conflict involving Europe's dominant powers: France, Austria, England, the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, and others. These empires weren't fighting over ideas. They were dividing the inheritance of a dead king who left no heirs. At that moment, Charles became the ultimate symbol of an empire that had devoured itself. In the following decades, Europe was reshaped. Dynasties shifted alliances, territories changed hands, and new kings from different bloodlines ascended to thrones. The Habsburgs would never return to Spain. In their place, the Bourbon dynasty rose, foreign in blood but politically stronger. A French prince became the new Spanish king, Philip V, grandson of Louis XIV. This was a humiliation for the old aristocracy, but a salvation for a country barely standing. All subsequent historians, doctors, anatomists, and geneticists who studied Charles arrived at the same conclusion. He could not have been saved, because he was never built for life. He was the product of a political obsession with dynastic purity, one that rejected science, reason, and morality. Ironically, those who tried to preserve power in the family were the very ones who destroyed it from within. In Spain, the memory of Charles remains uncomfortable. Unlike other monarchs, his image is rarely used in national symbols, textbooks, or museums. In public consciousness, he remains the monster king, though in truth he was a victim. In the 21st century, researchers revisited his DNA. They discovered that his inbreeding coefficient exceeded 25%, higher than if his parents had been full siblings. Charles never had a choice. He didn't want to be king. He didn't seek power. He was simply born into a misengineered empire where blood was valued more than life. His suffering became the price paid for the ambitions of others. His name entered history not for victories, but for the physical breakdown of a man, a metaphor for the collapse of an empire. This is not a story about the madness of one man. It's about the suicide of a great dynasty. The Habsburgs built the largest Catholic empire in Europe, but they couldn't build a healthy human being. The story of Charles II is a warning that power without limits, dynastic ambition without morality, and fear of losing status can produce not a king, but a sentence for an entire nation. After the death of Charles II, Spain could no longer continue to exist in the form his ancestors had created. The country was exhausted by wars, the economy was effectively destroyed, and the gold from the Americas had long stopped arriving in the quantities that once supported the monarchy. During his reign, not a single significant reform was implemented, no major infrastructure project was built, and no new universities were founded. Governance of the empire came down to the inert maintenance of old structures that had already ceased to function. Chaos reigned in the provinces, corruption in the colonies, and irresponsible bureaucracy in the royal court. Over the 35 years of Charles's reign, the country steadily declined. Foreign policy was entirely subordinate to external influences: France, the Vatican, the Holy Roman Empire. None of the political alliances formed during his reign were initiated independently by Spain. It was precisely due to the helplessness of royal power that the War of the Spanish Succession became inevitable. No European power believed that Spain was capable of making decisions on its own, and so they all chose to act by force. Charles not only failed to defend his country, he didn't even comprehend the scale of its collapse. His life was isolated, limited to a few rooms, religious rituals, and decrees he neither read nor understood. Courtiers reported that in his final years he could not sign documents without assistance. His hand trembled so badly that nuns had to support his elbow. One diplomat wrote in a letter, "The empire signs treaties with a dead body." Charles's greatest tragedy was that he became a prisoner not only of his genetics but also of a system that allowed neither reform nor self-reflection. Anyone who attempted to change anything in the structure of power was declared an enemy of the church or the monarchy. Authority continued to imitate efficiency, even though nothing worked anymore. Spain was rotting from within, and Charles, unaware of this, simply played his part. Ironically, even after death, Charles remained a political factor. His body became a point of contention. The Bourbons demanded that he be buried with their own ceremonial rites. The Habsburgs wanted to control access to the coffin, and the Vatican sent a special representative to confirm that the king had died in the faith. Even death did not relieve him of political weight. On the international stage, Charles's death was seen as a signal of global realignment. His weakness and helplessness became arguments for those who wanted to change the rules of the geopolitical game. Monarchs of other nations began to revise dynastic alliances, reform their courts, and avoid close familial inbreeding. At least superficially, his tragedy prompted caution in dynastic policy, especially in Austria, where the Habsburgs realized that without intermarriage with other houses, they would face the same fate. Spain entered a new era in which there was no longer room for the old principles. With the arrival of the Bourbons, cautious attempts at modernization began. But the shadow of Charles II lingered over the country for a long time. His portraits were removed from walls, he was not mentioned in official speeches, and only later did historians return to this period, calling it not a reign, but a period of waiting for death. The story of Charles II did not end with his burial. His legacy haunted Spain and Europe long after his body was sealed in the crypt. The monarchy he represented was so exhausted, so discredited, that even the arrival of a new dynasty could not immediately restore public trust. The War of the Spanish Succession, triggered by his death, dragged on for more than a decade and left the country in a state of chaos. Spain lost much of its influence in Europe and its international prestige declined dramatically. Charles was rarely mentioned in public discourse during the 18th and 19th centuries. Monarchs and politicians avoided referencing him, seeing his reign as an embarrassment, a symbol of failure. For decades, historians had no consensus on how to even categorize his rule. Was he a king? A placeholder? A relic? Many simply referred to him as the unfortunate. And some textbooks described him as a ruler who held the crown but never ruled. In medical circles, the case of Charles II became one of the most cited examples of dynastic inbreeding. His name appeared in genetic studies, medical textbooks, and research on royal bloodlines. The term Habsburg jaw, once a mere family trait, turned into a cautionary label, a visible symbol of the biological cost of political arrogance. In the 21st century, when scientists reanalyzed genealogical data, they estimated that Charles had one of the highest levels of inbreeding ever recorded in a royal lineage. His genetic profile revealed signs of immune deficiencies, neurological disorders, and developmental impairments, all consistent with the symptoms he exhibited during life. But beyond science and politics, Charles also became a metaphor. In literature, satire, and modern culture, he appeared not as a historical figure, but as a warning. He represented the ultimate product of a system that valued bloodlines more than competence, appearances more than reality, and control more than compassion. He embodied the failure of a civilization that collapsed not because of foreign enemies, but because of its refusal to change. His story is taught today in universities not only as a tale of political decline, but as a multidisciplinary case study, involving history, genetics, psychology, ethics, and governance. Charles is no longer just a footnote in dynastic charts. He is an emblem of systemic failure. His inability to function as a monarch wasn't a personal flaw. It was the logical outcome of centuries of decisions made by others who prioritized legacy over life. The modern world, with all its advancements, still faces the same risks in different forms: isolation in leadership, echo chambers of power, resistance to reform, and institutions that refuse to self-correct. In this sense, the legacy of Charles II is more relevant than ever. His life shows what happens when an empire becomes trapped in its own myth. He was not a tyrant, not a conqueror, not even a ruler in the true sense. He was a man born into a machine that needed a king, and broke the man in trying to make one. His death did not mark the end of an era, but rather exposed how long that era had already been dead. And so Charles II of Spain remains, not as a statue in a square or a name chanted in glory, but as a silent lesson carved into the bones of Europe, that no bloodline is sacred, no dynasty eternal, and no empire immune to its own blindness. After the death of Charles II, his name gradually disappeared from political discourse. The new Spanish kings of the Bourbon dynasty did not mention him in their speeches. His portraits were taken down from palace walls, and no memorial ceremonies were held. Officially, he remained part of royal history, but it was a history few wished to acknowledge. Among the elites, his reign became a symbol of degeneration and defeat, a dark chapter best left unopened. It wasn't until the 19th century that historians began returning to his figure. At first, the interest was purely dynastic, later medical. His portraits, depicting the grotesquely enlarged lower jaw, were analyzed by physicians. In Europe's anatomical lecture halls, discussions about inbreeding among monarchs began with Charles II. His face became the primary visual aid for the concept of biological collapse caused by political obsession with pure bloodlines. In the 20th century, Spain saw the first attempts to reinterpret his legacy. Some historians sought to defend Charles not as a ruler but as a human being. They emphasized that his deformities were not a result of his choices, but of his ancestry. He had no agency, no influence, no real power. In these narratives, he was not a weak monarch, but a victim of a rigid system. At the same time, they acknowledged that this very victimhood played a central role in dragging the empire to the brink of collapse. In popular culture, Charles II appeared rarely but memorably. In 18th century satirical engravings, he was drawn with exaggerated facial features, teeth down to the chin and bulging eyes. French and English caricaturists mocked not just his appearance but the very idea of a monarchy that could produce such rulers. In some 19th and 20th century Spanish novels, his name appears in the context of national decline and the loss of dignity, sometimes with pity, sometimes with shame. Today's scholars see in him more than just a historical anomaly. He is a case study in how a political system can devour its own product, how the idea of preserving power at any cost can lead to its total dissolution. Charles II embodied all the worst traits of absolutism: clerical domination, genetic isolation, institutional stagnation, performative governance, and fear of reform. His life is now studied not simply as a biography but as a warning. For politicians, about the dangers of closed power systems. For biologists, about the catastrophe of genetic isolation. For historians, about the final chapters of eras that failed to adapt. Spain changed after Charles, but his presence never fully vanished. It remains in the silence of palaces, in forgotten portraits, and in textbooks that describe what happens when an empire raises not a king, but its own demise.